Okay, uh, I hope you would have gone through the other two poems, and now we begin with the last poem in our syllabus, Shelley's Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. Uh, this was written in 1816, so the last poem that we covered was Ode to the West Wind, which was written in 1819, and the other one, Ozymandias, in 1817. So, this in fact is an earlier poem. But while reading Shelley, keep in mind that Ozymandias is a very different kind of a poem which we have already discussed. Uh, Whereas the other two poems have, you'll find some overlapping similarities, some concerns which are common to both the poems. Uh, this poem is primarily more philosophical in nature, and uh, as we discussed in our introduction to Shelley when we started with Ozymandias, I talked about how Shelley was influenced by mm, uh, Plato's idea of forms with a small uh, handout which I have given to you, I mean, mailed to you all, has all that details covered there. Just to repeat it, the basic notion was that uh, the Platonic belief system held or holds that the outward material forms are only secondary manifestations of the ideal forms uh, are uh, uh, which are the immaterial abstract uh, ideas. So there is that transcendental realm of the abstract, and the material world which we inhabit is, in a way, um a second hand kind of an experience that we have as human subjects. So the reality that is around us is actually uh, not the reality of the transcendental realm, but it is of the material realm. And this is there in the basic distinction of the body and the soul. The body being the material, the soul being the transcendent uh, phenomena of existence, and the abstract idea of forms uh, and the material objects and realities around us correspond to the soul and the body, and these sort of ideas are there. Uh, Now you'll find similar sort of ideas here in Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, and also in the Ode to West Wind when he talked about uh, the West Wind as that imperceptible uh, power which uh, operates through the human and the natural world and brings about certain changes almost imperceptibly to us. However, it is a real phenomena still, but the language in which he's talking about is very much drawing from the Platonic vocabulary. But here he goes on to the more minute details of how uh, the abstract and the material interact and function. And one difference that is important for us to understand right from the outset is that uh, in Shelley you will not find that kind of a hierarchy that is there in Plato, for instance, between the transcendental abstract realm and the material realm. It's almost as if in Platonic thought you would find that the material is of a lesser degree, of a lesser value in terms of its experiential quality, in terms of its importance and relevance to human existence and life, and the abstract, the ideal with the capital I, the forms with the capital F, are in a sense more important and more quote unquote real than the real world that we inhabit. Okay, so it's a transcendental uh, philosophy and worldview which is there. In this poem, what you would find would be that uh, uh, that Shelley is questioning, or in a sense reworking, that Platonic idea where he says that uh, it is actually through our perception of the real material forms and their apprehension, that is their understanding, or in that process is when we get to realize about that uh, imperceptible transcendental power or force that operates through the various material manifestations around us. Okay, it's just a change in emphasis if you notice carefully. Once again, what Shelley says is that, or what we'll find through this poem is that the abstract, the transcendental, and in Shelley's case, particularly the mystical, is apprehended or realized when the human mind is able to perceive that transcendental quality, that abstract power running through various material things around us, the human beings, our thoughts, uh, our material objects around us, our actions, etc. While engaged in all of this, we apprehend or understand the universal, the capital A abstract, the capital A ideal and transcendental in rare moments. Okay, and we do it how? Through not purely merely through empirical observation, but through uh, the faculty of imagination, which is capable of seeing beyond the mere rational empirical evidence in front of us. Okay, because the rational empirical evidence would provide us with very scientific causal relations about phenomena, about uh, uh, things that we experience in life, whereas the poetic mind would be capable to see through the 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 everyday, the external, the object world, and identify and realize that organic power, which in a sense makes it our existence a unified whole uh, through the poetic mind. That is what you will find in the poem. Okay, and as we see by the title, it is a hymn to intellectual beauty. And if you read the couple of essays that I sent you, or maybe I would be sending you, uh, how you'll also find this idea how Shelley is reworking the idea of the Christian hymn. Okay, which is usually sung in prayer to uh, Christ or any idea in the Bible, God, etc. Now, Shelley was an atheist and he wrote a paper called The Necessity of Atheism, which got him expelled from college. And so, we should not confuse this hymn as something of a religious incantation in that sense, but it is a hymn to intellectual beauty. Okay, and this intellectual beauty is not that of a poet, not his own intellect. Okay, it is that intellectual power in that sense, or the uh, intellectual force that in a intellectual force which uh, runs through every material phenomena around us, and also the imaginative capability. Rather, it's let me put it this way, that it is not the individual poet's intellect that he is talking about. He is talking about the quality of intellect in that sense, almost like an imaginative faculty. The intellect is okay. It's a hymn to that intellectual beauty. Okay, which he also calls uh, power. There are again, it's a poem which is wrought with a lot of contestation amongst critics whether this intellectual beauty equates to the unseen power in the first line, or unseen power is something else. The awful shadow is the intellectual beauty. Okay, so it's there's no one word about it per se, but what we are going to do today is read this intellectual beauty as uh, being referred to by multiple names in the poem, one of which is the unseen power. Okay, and with this, let us begin. Okay, uh, the poem begins thus: the awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen, among us. So there is an awful shadow. Awful means awe-inspiring, powerful. Awful shadow of some unseen power. For the time being, read it as intellectual beauty. The awful shadow. So it is the shadow of the power, unseen power, intellectual beauty, which floats among us unseen. Okay. Visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower. They visit this various world, that is this variety of things around us, multi faceted existence that we have. Okay, this phenomena of nature, of humanity, of thought and action, everything that is there on the material, in the material, and even thoughts would be considered material in this sense, because they are in a sense occurring to human beings, and uh, when we are able to conceptualize it, it becomes a material existence in that sense. Okay, the awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen, among us. So it is floating all around us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower. Okay, this awful shadow which is floating around, it visits this various world inconstantly. Okay, the power is in existence, but it in a sense manifests itself inconstantly in objects, in materials and things. Okay, now is another thing which is contentious here is that whether it is the power or the intellectual beauty, or its shadow which visits. Now we'll come to why the power and intellectual beauty would not visit, or power or intellectual beauty would not visit us or the human mind directly, but would only be available to us as an apprehension of in its shadow form. Okay, well, because one reason that of course is that you cannot grasp the all animating or the all energizing power, uh, because of your limited human capacities. It can only visit you as an intimation. Remember, something like an intimation, not the exact thing, but it's intimation. So, as an apprehension, as a shadow, and only visits us. That is almost as if it is perceived in things by us momentarily, inconstantly. Floats though unseen among us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower. The summer wind is blowing; it goes from flower to flower, or touches uh, each and every flower and moves it around uh, momentously. It's not continuous. Okay. Also, like moonbeams that behind some piney mountains shower, it visits with inconstant glance, just like moonbeams coming from behind mountains. Okay, it visits with inconstant glance each human heart and countenance. Okay, now he's coming to the point. Basically, it is apprehended by the human, or the human beings are only so blessed, quote unquote, in the sense to apprehend that the shadow of that power, not the power directly, the shadow, the manifestation of that power, okay, inconstantly. Like hues and harmonies of evening, like clouds in starlight widely spread, like memory of music fled, like anything that for its grace may be dear and yet dearer for its mystery. Because it's mysterious, so all these things like clouds in starlight widely spread, so they are not they are coalesced together. Okay, there are scattered memories of a music flood. You cannot don't have memories, a continuous kind of a memory that keeps going on. It is imperceptible, suddenly comes and goes. So that is a quality of the shadow of this unseen power, which for the time being we are reading as intellectual beauty, the unseen power. Now he calls it with another name. Okay, spirit of beauty. That's again intellectual beauty he is referring to. Okay, one reason why I would like to persist in reading this unseen power as intellectual beauty is that this multiple names with which Shelley calls it, it's not, in a sense, uh, one thing. The unseen power, the most, uh, uh, the most uh, accurate, or let me say the most, or the word which encapsulates the phenomena of this thing is power. Okay, and then you can call it intellectual beauty or spirit of beauty or anything. Okay, other words. And because there is no one single name by which he continues referring to that, is also an indication of how that power is apprehended in the poet's mind each time he talks about it, each time he thinks about it, conceptualizes about it. He uses a different term, a word to uh, refer to that power. Okay. Just go through the first stanza again and you'll get a feel of what the rest of the poem is going to look like. It's a hymn, remember? So again, like just like you in a hymn you call upon God with different names, same phenomena, the abstract phenomena with different names. He's calling to intellectual beauty, referring to intellectual beauty with different names in each of the stanzas pretty much. And also keep in mind that this is not God, this is not Jesus Christ, or this is not any theological God per se. It is the power that he is talking about. Okay, that animates the various uh, manifestations of the world, in the world that we inhabit. Okay, the awful shadow of some unseen power floats, though unseen, among us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower. Like moonbeams that behind some piney mountain shower, it visits with inconstant glance each human heart and countenance. Like hues and harmonies of evening, like clouds and starlight widely spread, like memory of music fled, like art that for its grace may be dear and yet dearer for its mystery. So you know it by virtue of its grace, and yet it is mysterious, and it is more dear to you because it is mysterious. Again, note the vocabulary, the word, the terminology. Grace is a very typical Christian word. Okay, when you're touched by the blessings of the Almighty, it is grace. So he'll keep using these terms and vocabulary of the Christian hymn to talk about uh, a non-Christian or a non-theological uh, power that which animates the universe. Okay, spirit of beauty that does consecrate. Again, consecration is a very typical Christian religious term. Spirit of beauty that does consecrate with thine own hues all thou dost shine upon of human thought and form. Basically, spirit of beauty, you which consecrate, bless with thine own hues all thou dost shine upon. In a sense, it gives, in a sense, beauty and different colors. The colors and the objects and the colors of the objects and the beauty that we perceive of them, in a sense, is given by the many manifestations of that beauty. So it's in a kind of a two-way traffic which is there between that abstract power of intellectual beauty, the spirit of beauty, and uh, the objects that we see. Basically, one cannot really be understood or apprehended without the other. Okay, the other things are there, hence, we are able to apprehend uh, that power, intellectual beauty. And because there is intellectual beauty and that unseen power whose shadow is imperceptibly moving around, which gives hues and color to different objects, material worlds. So that's why this organic unity which is there between the two. Okay. And which does consecrate with thine own hues all that thou shine upon of human thought and form. So human thought, the abstract human thought and form, both are colored by the intellectual beauty. And then he says, where art thou gone? Where are you gone? Why does thou pass away and leave our state, this dim vale of tears, vacant and desolate? So why have you gone? Saying this to intellectual beauty. As we see that its shadow is visiting everything, including the poet and its poetic mind, uh, transiently, for moments. Okay. So it must, and later on we find that there was a moment when it fell upon him, and now he feels that it has gone, it has left him. Probably it is touching upon some other poetic mind, his contemporary. Okay. But again, this also tells you of how uh, the romantic mind thinks of subjective truth, the subjective world. Okay. So for him, it is gone, so he feels that it is gone, it has left us. Probably it is animating some other human faculty. That's, this part was an aside, though. Uh, Coming back to the poem. Uh, Spirit of beauty that does consecrate with thine own hues all thou dost shine upon of human thought and form, where art thou gone, leaving everything desolate? Ask why the sunlight not forever weaves rainbows over your mountain rivers. So we ask all these questions, isn't it? That why there is no perpetual rainbow, okay, caused by the sunlight over the mountain river? Why anything should fail and fade that once is shown? And why is everything so transient? Why fear and dream and death and birth cast on the daylight of this earth such gloom? So it is change. It is that constant cycle of change that you're caught in that makes you anxious. What is going to happen tomorrow? What is it going to be like in 1 year ahead? What is going to be life ultimately after I die? So these are the questions of the ephemeral existence that you have on earth which cause this anxiety. Why man has such a scope for love and hate, despondency and hope? Why such extremes between which human beings dangle? Okay. And he goes on to say that no voice from some sublimer world hath ever to sage or prophet these responses given. These are questions, the ones that he's asked just above, have not been answered to any sage, that is any hermit, religious or renunciator, religious person, renunciator, or poet even. Not poet has also gotten this answer. And by these he also implies philosophers. Okay, if you read, as I asked you to his defense on poetry, the excerpts that I've given, you'll find some of these things there, and also the another collection of Shelley's work that I had emailed you, which has very small, it's a small 3-4 page write up by Shelley on life, his views on life, which he wrote roughly around the same time. You'll find these sort of views there very, very clearly evident. Okay, the kind of ideas that he's expressing in this poem. So, no voice from some sublimer world hath ever to sage or poet these responses given. Nobody knows about these questions of life. Why is there ephemerality? Okay. and also the ephemerality that they don't know about. Why are we able to apprehend this organic unity in creation? In why are we able to apprehend and understand the power that animates the natural world and us, the material and the abstract, the connection between these? Okay. Why aren't we able to understand all this and just stay and live with this knowledge throughout? Okay, it dawns upon us for a moment and then it leaves us. We get busy with our day to day mundane activities, worrying, fretting, being anxious again and again, even if you know. But this apprehension, this feeling, this uh, apprehension means that apprehension is something different from comprehension. Comprehension would be understanding. So you understand about all of these things on a philosophical abstract level. But at the level of feeling, this unity, this oneness with this abstract power, and the unity between this world that we inhabit and the force, the power, the unseen power that animates it. Okay, the intellectual beauty that is running basically this entire game of life, of existence. Why aren't we able to live with this feeling permanently? Okay, this is the kind of agony and anxiety with, or um, you know, torment with which these lines, this poem is written. Understanding is one thing, feeling is one thing. Again, a very typical romantic notion. For the empiricist, understanding would have been sufficient. Understanding would have been only rational, empirical understanding, okay, comprehension, not feeling. No voice from some sublimer world, from the other world. That is also crucial. The answer is not coming from the other world, okay, some sublime world of the heavens, okay, or the world of the transcendental world of the soul. No answer is coming from there. That is also crucial. So, what you apprehend is from the material world, but not only material reality is what you apprehend, you see the transcendental in the material, you see the abstract in the tangible, you see the whole one unity in the various manifestations around. Okay, that is the crux of this worldview. No voice from some sublimer world hath ever to sage or poet these responses given. Therefore, the names of demon, ghost, and heaven remain the records of their vain endeavor. So they have all tried to find out the answer, and what they have come up with are names like demon, ghost, and heaven, which to Shelley would be useless and also misleading to mankind. Remain the records of their vain endeavor. Fair spells, they are like frail spells rather, weak spells. Okay, spells of magic. Religion also, he counts in the same heaven because he says in the same single sentence. Okay, these are all frail, weak spells whose utter charm might not avail to sever from all we hear and all we see doubt, chance, and mutability. When you utter the frail spells of religion, of supernatural incantations, invocations, their uttered charm might not avail to sever, might not help in severing, in doing away, removing from whatever we hear and see doubt, chance, and mutability. Doubt, something as opposed to hope. Chance, as opposed to a plan. Chance is randomness, and mutability is change. You constantly age. Okay, just like you can see on my face. Okay, you constantly age, and that's how it is. But your mind is not put to rest about perpetual state of doubt, perpetual state of randomness, and the anxiety about constant change, and ultimately that you will decay and die. Okay, uh, nothing is able to remove all these thoughts chains from our existence, be it religion, be it any supernatural, magical uh, chants or charms or hymns or prayers. Okay. Thy light alone, that is the light of intellectual beauty, the unseen power. Thy light alone, like mist over mountains driven, or music by the night wind sent through strings of some still instrument, or moonlight on a midnight stream, gives grace and truth to life's unquiet dream. Uh, so it is. So then, if religion, supernatural ideas, all of them fail, what chips in? What comes to the rescue? It is the light of intellectual beauty, the unseen power, which, like mist over mountains driven, you can imagine the entire the sublime imagery that is there, mysterious. Okay, or music by the night wind sent through strings of some still instrument. Remember the Aeolian harp? Okay, music sent by night wind blowing through strings of some still instrument, of some mute instrument, which only when the wind blowing in nature interacts with an instrument of human creation, okay, that grace and truth is given to life's unquiet dream. It is something like that. So you can imagine the poetic mind or the poet's mind as that Aeolian harp. Just like the Aeolian harp is mute, silent, until it is played upon by the wind. Okay. Similarly, the poet's mind, which is mute and quiet, until it is played upon by intellectual beauty, its apprehension, that we get it. Until that happens, we are anxious, and only after the poet's mind is played upon by intellectual beauty, that grace and truth is given to life's unquiet, restless dream. Okay, because that is the moment when you realize about the wholeness and the unity of everything. Okay, uh, again, you see the different things that he is putting together in these few lines. The typical romantic investment in the idea of the Aeolian harp and nature. Why is it again important? Aeolian harp is a man-made instrument of music which doesn't produce any sound. The melody that the best melody that it produces is when the natural phenomena plays upon that object of human craft and creation and produces music. Okay, something which is melodious and beautiful. The coming together of the natural, that is the wind, and the uh, the material, that is the instrument of music, the Aeolian harp. The coming together of the natural and the human creation, the natural phenomena and the human creation produces music. That's why this imagery of the Aeolian harp is very central, very crucial to the romantic idea of beauty, melody, and the relation between the human and the natural. Okay, and here it is the in the philosophical poetry of Shelley, it is the intellectual beauty which plays upon the human mind and gives hope, gives grace and truth to life's unquiet dream. Not religion, not going to church, not going to any temple or mosque or anything, but this realization of intellectual beauty. Next stanza, he begins by saying, continuing with the grace and the truth part, using certain typical tropes of Christian hymns, religious hymns, and continuing with it in the fourth stanza. Love, hope, and self-esteem like clouds depart and come, for some uncertain moments lent. Now he's reversing the in the original Christian uh, prayer, or in the Bible. If you look at the note, somewhere it is given. Uh, you will find that he's replaced faith with love, hope remains hope, and charity with self-esteem. So instead of faith, hope, and charity, which is there in the Bible, he is using love, hope, and self esteem. Not faith. Faith is not going to solve your problem, he is saying. It is love. Okay. Hope remains there. And not charity, but self esteem. Okay. Probably because charity could make you feel a little, you know, uh, uh, that you are pitying someone or something like that. Okay, faith could be blind faith after a point, but love. This is talking about the love of humanity, hope in the good, and self-esteem that you as an individual are part of this organic unity and game. Okay, so self-respect in that sense. Okay, that means you are also part of the power with a capital P. You are also a small tiny block in that. Okay, so in a sense, it gives you more agency to act. But he says, like intellectual beauty, love, hope, and self esteem, like clouds, depart and come, coming and going, for some uncertain moments lent. Very much like how the shadow of the unseen power, the spirit of beauty, which comes and goes. Likewise, probably when it comes, it brings along love, hope, and self esteem. Okay, like clouds depart and come, for some uncertain moments lent. And then he says, what if that these feelings and intellectual beauty and that power with a capital P would have been a permanent reality of your existence, or you were able to be in the know of, or in the would you, if you had been able to carry them within yourself permanently, what would have done to you? He's saying man were immortal and omnipotent. Man would have been immortal and omnipotent. Didst thou, if you, unknown and awful as thou art, awe-inspiring, powerful, O awful, keep with thy glorious train firm state within his heart. Okay. Man would have been immortal and omnipotent if you, who are immortal and awful, would have stayed in his heart. Okay, forever. Now, is this a lament, or is this also a good thing, in a sense that uh, probably man might have become a tyrant had he known of such uh, inherent goodness and power in him. Okay. So, in a sense, or in other words, what makes you human is the fact, that's probably the better way to put it. What makes you more human is the fact that you are not immortal and omnipotent, yet you can be feel that immortality and that omnipotence in transient spells, when you are given access to that feeling, when intellectual beauty touches you with grace. Thou messenger of sympathies that wax and wane in lovers' eyes. Okay, remember he's talking about love in the very first line. But this is not just the love between, it's a symbolic or a metaphoric way of talking about love. It's not romantic love primarily that he means, it's the love for humanity. Thou messenger of sympathies, that is understanding, exchange. Okay, that wax and wane in lovers' eyes. So it's a good imagery perhaps. So probably you don't see your lover with the same level of devotion or attachment or understanding continuously. It's waxing and waning. Okay. Thou messenger of sympathies that wax and wane in lovers' eyes, thou that to human thought are nourishment, like darkness to a dying flame. So you are to human thought you are like nourishment, like the human like the dying flame is uh, uh, like darkness nourishes the dying flame. In a sense, the darker it is, it's an imagery, not really practical or scientific kind of a thing. uh, The like darkness in a sense gives, the darker it is, the more uh, the faintest of flames would be seen in a sense burning, or you could see this would be perceptible. Okay. Similarly, the intellectual beauty nourishes human thought, gives it hope, gives it self-esteem. Depart not, lest the grave should be like life and fear a dark reality. So in a sense, give us the courage to face death. Okay, depart not. Otherwise, the grave should be what life is at the moment, a fear, like a fear and a dark reality. So again, he's invoking the intellectual beauty to uh, not leave mankind for good. Okay, or in other words, he is not able to have access to that intellectual beauty which he knows exists, persists. Okay, but he is not able to apprehend it, feel it. So in a sense, it's an invocation to that beauty to come back. It's much like the west wind. Okay, where he wants the west wind to carry him like a leaf or a cloud or a wave, etc. And now, the next stanza, we come to know that he has had an intimation of that the shadow of uh, the unseen power, intellectual beauty, and a very Wordsworthian kind of again imagery, a scene that he talks about in the next stanza, something which also read in the previous poem, Ode to the West Wind. He says, while yet a boy, I sought for ghosts and sped through many a listening chamber, cave and ruin, and starlight wood, with fearful steps pursuing hopes of high talk with the departed soul. Okay, so having these supernatural, uh, quote unquote, mystical experiences with the other world, the sublimer world, which he refers to in the third stanza. Okay, and as a boy, enchanted by these ideas, uh, he uh, gets drawn into and experiments with of these sorts. Okay, I called upon on poisonous names with which our youth is fed. The note would tell you uh, the religious terms such as ghost, God, and heavens. Okay, all of these terms, poisonous names. He is Shelley, so you can imagine why. I was not heard. I saw them not. Again, empiricism. If you take a look at the previous stanza also, or rather the third stanza, and look at the sixth line, when he's talking about again the same idea of demon, ghost, and heavens, the experiments other have conducted, he says that nothing, there was no answer, and doubt, chance, and mutability was not severed from all we hear and all we see. Okay, again, an empiricist model of understanding the world. If you depend upon an empiricist outlook of understanding the world, your existence, its meaning, probably all this is not going to, doubt, chance, mutability, anxiety, apprehensions are not going to go away. Okay, you need to look beyond the empirical and venture into the imaginative, which would be given to you when intellectual beauty, the power, visits you like that wind playing upon the Aeolian harp. I was not heard, I saw them not. When musing deeply on the lot of life at that sweet time when winds are weighing all vital things that wake to bring news of birds and blossomings, early dawn perhaps, or spring. Sudden, thy shadow fell on me. I shrieked and clasped my hands in ecstasy. Again, compare it to that latter Wordsworthian mode of thinking in Inton Abbey. So, not excitement, passion, or fanatical frenzy to know the truth, but when musing deeply on the lot of life, not through empiricism. He's just thinking, going deep within his mind about what is the meaning of life. Engaging with questions such as these. At that sweet time when winds are wooing all vital things that wake to bring news of birds and blossomings, early morning perhaps, after the night is spent in the chambers. Okay, he's talking about early morning. He's also talking about probably spring. Okay, that is the season when this happens, youth. Uh, Sudden, thy shadow fell on me. Again, it's a shadow of intellectual beauty, the imperceptible shadow of the first line, the awful shadow of some unseen power, which your shadow, thy shadow fell on me suddenly. Again, this is a very typical idea of sudden revelation that happens in religious theological experiences. Okay, so not through these rituals of talking to the ghost, etc., but going within some sort of spiritual search, deeply musing on the lot of life. At that sweet time, etc., thy shadow fell on me sudden. I shrieked and clasped my hands in ecstasy. Typical experience of the divine, the revelation. Now here it is, keep in mind, it is not that kind of divine which you associate with any religion. Okay. And he says, I vowed, after that experience, I vowed that I would dedicate my powers to thee and thine, that is to you, intellectual beauty, and thine, all that you animate, all that you manifest in different, the various world of the second line of the poem. To thee and thine, have I not kept the vow? Rhetorical question he's asking. With beating heart and streaming eyes, great emotion, very religious kind of imagery, typically. Even now, I call the phantoms of 1,000 hours. Uh, Phantoms, not probably real phantoms, but the phantoms of the hours gone by, the ghost of the hours, not the real ghost. He thinks about, even now, I call the phantoms of 1,000 hours, the insubstantial experience of that time, which is now past, 1,000 hours, each from his voiceless grave. The ghost of hours, basically time that he's calling, not a real ghost, if ghosts are real, that is. Uh, each from his voiceless grave. Why? Because they have envisioned bowers, trees, etc., of studious zeal or love's delight, outwashed with me the envious night. The time has been my witness, basically, he's saying, on that night when I had that experience. They know that never joy illumined my brow, unlinked with hope. All the time that I spent contemplating, meditating upon it, on you, on the lot of life, which brought about your apprehension, all that time, those hours, they know that never joy illumined my brow, unlinked with hope. I was always full of joy, and it was always accompanied by hope that you would free this world from a dark slavery. That is intellectual beauty and power. That is his hope. That thou, you, O awful loveliness, would give whatever these words cannot express. That you, intellectual beauty, would, in a sense, inspire the world, give to this world what these words cannot express. So here he is acknowledging the limitation of the poet's craft, that despite his best, despite talking about such a profound experience of uh, being touched by intellectual beauty, that power, the capital P, uh, that he is not able to produce the kind of poetry that would do the same, would, in a sense, carry forward the same sort of experience to mankind. And of course, it wouldn't happen because it is only a second hand experience that he is talking about, or you as a reader, or me as a reader, would be reading about. It will not be the experience, it is one rendition of an experience by the poet. So there is that gap, that also another ideal of the romantic pursuit, which is impossible to realize, actualize, is doing away with the gap between the word and the meaning, and of course, between the poem and the actual experience, between feeling and expression. Okay, between feeling and expression, between idea and its execution, between the experience and its uh, its poetic rendition. Like Kubla Khan again was something of that sort. Um, and here again, okay, his poetry also would not be able to carry this experience forward that he had. Firstly, it would be hard for him to encapsulate it in his poem. Second, the reader would not be able to acquire the same sort of experience that he acquired. Okay, I'm sure you must be struggling to be moved as much by this poetry or Wordsworth's poetry or uh, Keats was probably better in conveying that idea. So we are in a sense always distant to the actual feeling with which the poetry is written because we feel the words in our own way. We understand them more perhaps than actually feel what they mean to say. So he says that he hopes, and he was full of hope. Time is the witness, can vouch for it, all the hours, that never once was he devoid of any hope that you, intellectual beauty, would free this world of dark slavery, that you, O awful loveliness, would give whatever these words cannot express. Okay. The day becomes more solemn and serene when noon is past. Again, echoing some of the very last stanzas of, or the last stanza particularly of Ode to the West Wind. Morning, night, he passes in trying to converse with ghosts. Morning, while contemplating, he gets the intimation, the shadow of the intellectual beauty. And by noon, he says, the day becomes more solemn and serene. Also, talking about noon also would mean, in a sense, more something like uh, uh, summer or maybe then summer and then approaching autumn. Okay, spring, the youth is past. The day becomes more solemn and serene when noon is past, noon is gone, so it must be autumn then. Noon would be summer. There is a harmony in autumn and a luster in the sky. It becomes more mature, which through the summer is not heard or seen. Okay. When you are young, when you are youthful, you are not able to hear that music or see that luster in the sky. As if it could not be, as if it had never been. Okay, it's almost, it just wasn't there, it was could never be. Thus let thy power, which like the truth of nature on my passive youth descended. Okay, thus let thy power, this is not the power with the capital P. Please make note of that. Okay, so what he'll now get, or what now he's asking for, a similar kind of a shadow, which is hoping and praying to fall upon himself. Okay, as it did when he was much younger. Okay, but he would pray for something else, something more profound now. He knows what to do with that feeling of being one with creation, feeling himself to be a part of that organic cosmic unity and wholeness. He says, thus let thy power, which like the truth of nature on my passive youth, truth of nature, okay, something permanent, something not transient, eternal. Like the truth of nature on my passive youth descended, his youth he was passive then, to my onward life supply its calm. Okay. To my onward life, the life which is left, supply its calmness. To one who worships thee and every form containing thee, you and your multifaceted manifestations. whom fair spirit, another name for intellectual beauty, whom fair spirit, the spells did bind to fear himself and love all mankind. Okay, so this self esteem, which he had talked about earlier, is not arrogance. It's like what he has learned from intellectual beauty, or the apprehension of intellectual beauty when its shadow fell on him, is to fear himself, to be uh, not omnipotent and immortal as he would have been had that beauty, intellectual beauty, and power stayed with him permanently. Okay, the momentary apprehension, the transient apprehension of it tells him, the experience tells him that to fear himself, that he should fear himself. Don't not become arrogant, not become megalomaniac, not become too haughty in his own mind, in his own powers. There is a superior power which is governing the likes of him. And he is an instrument, like a lyre, the Aeolian harp, being played upon by bigger powers. To fear himself and love all mankind. Okay, so a humanitarian kind of a philosophical outlook, worldview is given to him by that power, that intellectual beauty, because that intellectual beauty itself uh, touches all mankind. Okay, that power. Uh, okay, and alternatively, intellectual beauty. I mean, you have to simultaneously read it as the manifestation of that power. Okay, and the your very process of apprehending that power, because two of them are in a sense uh, one. Two of them cannot be dissociated. Okay, so this intellectual beauty also comes from, or this intellectual beauty is there for you as a poet because you have the mental faculty, the imagination to apprehend it. Okay, I mean, it is there, of course, uh, but its perception, the ability to perceive, also comes from the tuned in poetic mind, the imaginative mind, the sympathetic mind. Okay, all right, so this was a slightly more difficult poem, and the essay given on this poem at the back of your book is not very uh, easy to follow, in the sense it's a little confusing. You might find there the author is talk or the critic is talking about that the power, the unseen power which Shelley is talking about is something else which he calls the power of necessity, something which is we use to make connections. So I deliberately did not use or agree to. It also gives various sources from which Shelley would have come across or drawn this phrase intellectual beauty, Godwin, etc. There are 3-4 different sources. It's actually very hard to pinpoint to one. But in other essays, you will find, I'll send them to you. You would find that he uses this phrase intellectual beauty almost synonymously with the unseen power, the uh, uh, the in a sense that imaginative capacity that exists, and the poet in a sense shares in with that. So that would be a better way to put it. That's why intellectual beauty, not of one poet, not of himself, but as a faculty, as that higher kind of power which runs through everything, the poet being a part of it, the only difference being that the poet being more uh, imaginatively cultivated and more sympathetic in his uh, understanding and engagement with human nature, is able to uh, understand and know that he is a part of that larger intellectual beauty which runs through everything, and that is that power. Okay, that intellectual beauty is that power. So there is a difference in how I have read the poem, interpreted it, as opposed to what is given in the essay in this book. Uh, the two other essays which I've referred to in understanding this difficult, confusing sort of poem, I'll send them to you. And you also are free to make your own readings. And uh, the reading that I have made would probably make more sense to you if you read those essays, the parts that I've highlighted at least, and Shelley on life, the excerpt which is there in the works that I have sent you, PDF, very small PDF. Just run through it, take a quick run of it, and his views in the defense of poetry. Okay, vis-a-vis truth and the function on the role of the poet and how he connects to power and the higher power of the intellect, so on and so forth. Okay, so this was PB Shelley. I hope you enjoyed it, you liked it, and uh, do think about what PB Shelley's romantic quest is like, how his engagement with the questions of transience and permanence are perhaps different from those of Keats, how he thinks of uh, how he uses nature in his poetry, and for what end is he using nature in his poetry, as opposed to how, say, Coleridge is using it or Wordsworth is using it. Okay. Uh, so I hope you will go through all the material I've sent you and go through these lectures, these discussions, and by tomorrow or day after we would definitely move on to uh, Byron or Robert Burns. Uh, okay, thank you so much, and do keep reading. Send in your queries. Thanks. Take care.